Margaret Stevens had always believed the world owed her something special. At 52 years old, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no without throwing a fit about it. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive handbag spoke of suburban privilege, but her sharp eyes and pursed lips hinted at the storm that could brew at any moment. The morning started like any other Tuesday. Margaret had planned a solo trip to London, telling her husband it was for cultural enrichment. What she really wanted were Instagram photos that would make her neighbors jealous. She had booked the most expensive tour package, expecting royal treatment to match the royal locations. Standing outside Buckingham Palace at 9 in the morning, Margaret felt the familiar surge of entitlement that had carried her through countless restaurant complaints and store manager confrontations. The palace guards stood motionless in their red uniforms and tall black hats like living statues. Perfect photo opportunities, she thought. "Excuse me," Margaret called out to the nearest guard, a young man named James Mitchell who had been serving for 2 years. James kept his eyes forward following protocol. The guards were trained not to interact with tourists except in emergencies. Margaret stepped closer, her voice rising. "I'm talking to you. I paid good money for this tour and I expect some customer service." Still no response. James had dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about this woman's tone put him on edge. The tour guide, a patient woman named Sarah, gently tried to explain the rules. "Ma'am, the guards are on duty and cannot speak to visitors. It's tradition and protocol." Margaret's face flushed red. "Protocol? I'm an American citizen and I deserve respect. These people work for the government, which means they work for taxpayers like me." Her logic made no sense, but logic had never been Margaret's strong suit when she was building up to a tantrum. Other tourists began to notice the commotion. Phones came out not to photograph the palace but to record the unfolding drama. Margaret seemed to feed off the attention, her voice getting louder and more demanding. "You will acknowledge me right now, or I'm calling your supervisor," she shouted at James, who remained perfectly still. His training had prepared him for many situations, but an increasingly aggressive middle-aged woman was testing his patience in ways he hadn't expected. The tour guide tried again to defuse the situation. "Mrs. Stevens, perhaps we should move on to the next part of the tour. There's so much more to see." "No," Margaret snapped. "I'm not moving until this rude man apologizes for ignoring me." She planted herself directly in front of James, close enough that he could smell her overpowering perfume. The irony of calling someone else rude while disrupting their work was completely lost on her. James felt sweat beginning to form under his heavy uniform. The morning sun was getting warmer, and the woman's presence was making his job significantly more difficult. He had been taught to treat his post with dignity and respect, but she was making it nearly impossible to maintain his composure. Margaret pulled out her phone and began recording. "I'm documenting this abuse of American tourists," she announced loudly. "This guard is deliberately ignoring a paying customer who simply asked a polite question." The crowd around them grew larger, with most people looking embarrassed for the guard rather than sympathetic to Margaret's cause. 20 minutes passed with Margaret continuing her one-sided argument. She criticized everything from James's posture, to his uniform, to what she called typical British rudeness. The other tourists on her group had moved on, but Margaret refused to budge. That's when she made her first serious mistake. Frustrated by the guard's continued silence, Margaret reached out and poked James in the chest. "I know you can hear me," she said. The moment she made physical contact, James was required to respond. "Ma'am, please step back," James said firmly but politely. His voice carried the authority of his position, but also showed remarkable restraint, given the circumstances. Margaret's eyes lit up with triumph. "Finally. Now we're getting somewhere. I demand to speak to your commanding officer about your unprofessional behavior." James explained calmly that he was following proper protocol, and asked her again to step back. But Margaret had tasted victory in getting him to speak, and she wanted more. She moved even closer, now standing within inches of him. "You people think you're so special with your fancy hats and toy guns," she continued, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing but overpaid dress-up dolls for tourists to look at." The crowd was now clearly on James's side, with several people telling Margaret to leave the guard alone. But she was too deep into her performance to back down now. She had an audience, and she intended to give them a show they would never forget. Unfortunately, for Margaret, she was about to give them exactly that, but not in the way she expected. Her anger was building toward a crescendo that would change everything. The morning that had started as a simple sightseeing trip was about to become a viral nightmare that would follow her for years to come. James remained at his post, hoping his supervisor would intervene soon. He had no way of knowing that Margaret was just getting started, and that her next actions would create an international incident that neither of them was prepared for. The cameras kept rolling as Margaret's entitlement reached dangerous new heights. The situation escalated quickly when Margaret decided that words weren't enough to get her point across. James had been trained for many scenarios, but nothing had prepared him for what happened next. "You think you're better than me?" Margaret screamed, her face now red with rage. The crowd of tourists had grown to nearly 50 people, all with their phones pointed at the unfolding drama. Social media was already buzzing with live streams of the crazy American Karen at Buckingham Palace. James maintained his professional demeanor, though his jaw was clenched tight. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one final time to please step back and allow me to perform my duties." Margaret's response was swift and shocking. In a moment of pure rage, she lunged forward and actually bit James on the forearm, right through his ceremonial uniform. Her teeth sank into the fabric and the flesh beneath, causing James to cry out in pain and surprise. The crowd gasped collectively. Someone screamed. Dozens of phones captured the exact moment when Margaret Stevens crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had just assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras. James stumbled backward, clutching his arm where Margaret's teeth had left clear marks through his red tunic. Blood was beginning to seep through the fabric. The shock on his face was genuine. In 2 years of service, nothing had prepared him for being bitten by a tourist. Margaret stood there for a moment, seeming almost surprised by her own actions. Saliva dripped from her mouth as she realized what she had done. The adrenaline of her rage began to fade, replaced by a creeping awareness that she might have made a terrible mistake. "You attacked me first by ignoring me," she shouted, trying to justify her actions to the horrified crowd. "This is what happens when you disrespect paying customers." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Voices rose in anger, calling her disgusting, crazy, and worse. Several people were already on their phones with emergency services. Others were uploading the videos to every social media platform they could think of. Within seconds of the bite, palace security appeared. These weren't ceremonial guards. They were armed, trained security officers who took threats to the royal family and their property very seriously. Margaret's attack on James was being treated as a potential terrorist incident until proven otherwise. "Ma'am, you need to come with us immediately," commanded Officer Reynolds, a stern-faced woman who had dealt with many security breaches over the years. Margaret suddenly realized that her tantrum had attracted the attention of people she definitely didn't want to mess with. "This is ridiculous," Margaret protested as officers moved to surround her. "All I did was ask a simple question, and he refused to answer me like a civilized person." "Ma'am, you physically assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Guard," Officer Reynolds stated firmly. "You're under arrest." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Arrest? This wasn't supposed to happen. She was the victim here, wasn't she? These people were supposed to apologize to her and maybe give her some sort of compensation for the terrible service. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Margaret finally began to understand that this situation was spinning completely out of her control. The crowd around her was openly hostile now, with people calling her names and demanding she be thrown in jail. "I want to speak to the American embassy," she demanded, as officers began to lead her away. "This is a violation of my rights as an American citizen." Officer Reynolds wasn't impressed. "You'll have the opportunity to make your phone calls after you're processed, ma'am. Right now, you need to come with us quietly." But quiet wasn't in Margaret's vocabulary. As they led her toward a waiting police van, she continued to shout about her rights, about poor customer service, and about how this was all a big misunderstanding. Every word was being recorded by dozens of cameras. James was being attended to by a medic who had appeared with remarkable speed. The bite had broken the skin and would require proper medical attention. As they cleaned and bandaged his wound, James kept shaking his head in disbelief. "In 2 years of service, I've been yelled at, sworn at, and had things thrown at me," he told the medic. "But this is the first time anyone's actually bitten me like I was a piece of meat." The medic chuckled grimly. "Well, at least you'll have one hell of a story to tell your grandchildren someday." As Margaret was loaded into the police van, still protesting her innocence, she had no idea that her 15 seconds of internet fame were just beginning. The videos of her attacking James were already going viral, shared thousands of times across every major social platform. News outlets were picking up the story within hours. American tourist bites, Royal Guard at Buckingham Palace was trending worldwide. Margaret's name, face, and hometown were being shared by millions of people who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Her husband received his first phone call about the incident while he was at work. His secretary informed him that someone claiming to be a British police officer needed to speak with him urgently about his wife. At first, he thought it was a scam call. The police van carrying Margaret wound through London streets toward the Mincher station where she would be formally charged. As they drove, Officer Reynolds couldn't help but wonder what possesses someone to bite another human being during what should have been a simple tourist visit. Margaret sat in the back of the van, finally beginning to grasp that her actions might have serious consequences, but she still believed deep down that this was all just a big misunderstanding that would be cleared up once she explained her side of the story to someone in charge. She had no idea that her side of the story was already being seen by millions of people around the world, and that public opinion had already firmly decided who was right and who was wrong in this situation. The London Metropolitan Police Station buzzed with activity as Margaret Stevens was processed for assault. The desk sergeant had seen many unusual cases in his 20-year career, but American Tourist Bites Royal Guard was definitely going in his top 10 strangest arrests. Margaret sat in the holding cell, still wearing her expensive tourist outfit that now seemed ridiculous given her circumstances. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled from the struggle with officers, and her makeup was smeared from crying tears of frustration and disbelief. "This is insane," she muttered to herself for the 100th time. "I'm the victim here. That guard was rude and unprofessional. I was just defending myself." The reality of her situation was slowly sinking in, but Margaret's mind was working overtime to rewrite the story in a way that made her the wronged party. She had spent 52 years avoiding responsibility for her actions, and she wasn't about to start taking accountability now. Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh entered the interview room with a thick file and a cup of tea. She had watched the videos that were flooding social media, and she knew this case was going to attract significant attention from both the media and her superiors. "Mrs. Stevens, I'm Detective Inspector Walsh. I'll be handling your case today." Sarah's voice was professional but not unkind. She had dealt with enough Americans to know that cultural differences sometimes created misunderstandings, but biting someone was universal assault. Margaret immediately launched into her prepared speech. "Thank goodness, finally someone reasonable. Detective, I need to file a complaint against that guard who refused to help me. His behavior was completely unprofessional and I was forced to defend myself." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you saying that biting guard Mitchell was self-defense?" "Absolutely," Margaret replied with conviction. "He was intimidating me with his silence and his weapon. I felt threatened and acted instinctively to protect myself." The detective made notes, while trying to keep her expression neutral. Margaret's version of events bore no resemblance to what dozens of witnesses and multiple video recordings clearly showed. This was going to be a straightforward case. "Mrs. Stevens, I've reviewed the witness statements and video evidence. Multiple recordings show you approaching guard Mitchell, not the other way around. He never threatened you or made any aggressive moves." Margaret's face flushed again. "Those videos don't show the whole story. You can't see how he was intimidating me with his body language. I know threatening behavior when I see it. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, James Mitchell was having his wound properly treated at a nearby hospital. The bite had been deeper than initially thought, and doctors were concerned about infection. Human bites, they explained, could be more dangerous than animal bites due to the bacteria in human mouths. You'll need antibiotics and follow-up care, the doctor informed James. We also need to document everything for legal purposes. This will be evidence in the assault case. James nodded, still struggling to process what had happened. His phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from friends and family who had seen the videos online. The incident was being discussed on news programs, social media, and even late-night comedy shows. His commanding officer, Major Williams, arrived at the hospital with both concern and barely contained anger. "How are you? Holding up, Mitchell?" "Physically, I'll be fine, sir. Mentally, I'm still trying to understand what just happened. I've never had anyone react that violently to following protocol." Major Williams shook his head. "In 30 years of service, I've seen protesters, drunks, and every kind of difficult person you can imagine. But this woman attacked you for doing your job correctly. The footage is clear as day." Back at the police station, Margaret was making her one phone call. Her husband answered on the first ring, having been anxiously waiting after the earlier call from British authorities. "Tom, thank God," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "You need to get me out of here. These people have arrested me for defending myself against a rude government employee." Tom Stevens had been married to Margaret for 25 years, and he knew her well enough to read between the lines. "Margaret, what exactly did you do?" "Nothing. I asked a simple question, and when the guard ignored me, I may have gotten a little upset. But Tom, they're treating me like a criminal over nothing." Tom had access to the internet, and he had already seen the videos. His wife biting a royal guard was trending worldwide, and their hometown newspaper had already called his office for comment. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Margaret, I've seen the videos. Everyone has seen the videos. You bit a man." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. Margaret finally spoke in a smaller voice. "The videos make it look worse than it was. Margaret, you bit another human being. How could that possibly look worse than it actually is?" As the magnitude of her actions began to truly sink in, Margaret started to panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be home by now, posting jealousy-inducing photos of her London adventure. Instead, she was facing serious criminal charges in a foreign country. Detective Inspector Walsh returned with more questions and formal paperwork. "Mrs. Stevens, you're being charged with assault. Given the circumstances and the evidence, I strongly suggest you cooperate fully with our investigation." Margaret's mind raced. What kind of punishment are we talking about here? I mean, hypothetically, if someone were to be found guilty of this charge. Assault in the UK can carry significant penalties, including imprisonment. The fact that you attacked a member of the Royal Guard while on duty makes this a particularly serious matter. The word imprisonment hit Margaret like a physical blow. Prison. She had never even had a speeding ticket. This was supposed to be a vacation, not the beginning of a criminal record. Outside the police station, news vans were beginning to gather as word spread about the arrest. The story was too perfect for the media to ignore, entitled "American Tourist Attacks British Royal Guard Over Perceived Slight." It had everything audiences love to hate. Within hours of Margaret's arrest, the story had exploded across the internet like wildfire. Bitegate was trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing, commenting, and creating memes about the Royal Guard Karen. The footage of her sinking her teeth into James Mitchell's arm was being played on news stations across the globe. Back home in Westfield, New Jersey, Margaret's comfortable suburban life was being turned upside down. Her husband Tom sat in his living room watching his wife's face plastered across CNN as reporters discussed the shocking assault on British soil. Their neighbors were already gathering outside, some supportive but most simply curious about the spectacle. Margaret's sister called Tom within an hour of the story breaking. "Tom, please tell me this isn't real. Please tell me Margaret didn't actually bite a soldier." Tom rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. It's real, Linda. She really did it. I've seen the videos from 6 different angles. There's no denying what happened. Meanwhile, at the police station, Margaret was beginning to realize that her actions had consequences far beyond a simple misunderstanding. Detective Inspector Walsh returned with updates that made Margaret's situation exponentially worse. Mrs. Stevens, I need to inform you that this case has attracted significant media attention. There are news crews outside, and the story is being covered internationally. Margaret's stomach dropped. What do you mean internationally? This is just a local matter, right? Ma'am, you assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard at one of Britain's most famous landmarks. Multiple videos of the incident have been viewed millions of times. The American embassy has been contacted, and this is now a diplomatic issue as well as a criminal one. The words diplomatic issue sent Margaret into full panic mode. She had envisioned maybe having to pay a fine or write an apology letter. She hadn't considered that her moment of rage could create international headlines. I need a lawyer, Margaret said quietly. A really good lawyer, Detective Walsh nodded. That would be advisable, yes. At Buckingham Palace, James Mitchell was dealing with his own version of unwanted fame. Palace officials were fielding calls from reporters around the world wanting interviews with the guard who was bitten. Security protocols meant James couldn't speak to media, but his story was being told anyway through witness accounts and official statements. His mother called from Yorkshire, having seen the story on the evening news. James, love, are you all right? The news is saying some woman actually bit you. I'm fine, Mum. Physically, anyway. It's just surreal that this is getting so much attention. I was just doing my job. Well, that woman should be ashamed of herself. What kind of person bites another human being over nothing? James didn't have an answer for that question, but he was beginning to understand that Margaret Stevens had given the world a perfect example of entitled behavior taken to an extreme, that most people found both shocking and fascinating. Social media was having a field day with the story. Twitter was flooded with jokes, memes, and commentary about Karen culture and American tourist behavior. TikTok users were creating reenactments, reactions, and parodies. Instagram was full of posts criticizing Margaret's actions and supporting James. The hashtag #JusticeForJames began trending as people rallied behind the guard who had simply been doing his job. A GoFundMe page was created to help with his medical expenses, though it wasn't needed. It raised over £50,000 in the first day. Margaret's employer, a dental office where she worked as a receptionist, was also feeling the heat. Dr. Patricia Wells received dozens of calls and emails from people who had recognized Margaret from the videos. Dr. Wells, I saw that your employee attacked that poor guard in London. How can you continue to employ someone so violent? Was the typical message they received. Dr. Wells found herself in an impossible situation. Margaret had been a decent employee, but the negative publicity was affecting the practice. Patients were canceling appointments and staff members were uncomfortable with the association. Tom Stevens was dealing with similar issues at his accounting firm. His boss called him into a private meeting to discuss the situation. Tom, I understand this is a difficult personal situation, but we're getting calls from clients asking about our association with the story. Some are threatening to take their business elsewhere. Tom felt his carefully ordered life crumbling around him. Sir, I had nothing to do with what Margaret did. I'm as shocked as everyone else. I know that, Tom. But unfortunately, in today's world, guilt by association is a real thing. We need to consider how to handle this professionally. Back in London, Margaret was finally granted bail, but with strict conditions. She had to surrender her passport, report to authorities daily, and was forbidden from going near any royal properties. The American embassy had assigned a lawyer to help her navigate the British legal system, but the news wasn't encouraging. Mrs. Stevens, I need to be honest with you, said her court-appointed attorney, David Mills. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Multiple witness accounts, clear video footage, and physical evidence from the victim's medical treatment. The Crown Prosecution Service is taking this very seriously. Margaret sat in the embassy office, finally beginning to grasp the reality of her situation. What are my options? Your best option is to plead guilty and hope for leniency. Fighting this case would be expensive and likely futile given the evidence. A guilty plea might result in a lighter sentence. Sentence? Margaret's voice cracked. You mean prison time? It's possible, yes. Assault charges in the UK can result in imprisonment, especially when the victim is a public servant performing their duties. Margaret began to cry for the first time since her arrest, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity. Even facing serious criminal charges, she still couldn't accept that her actions were completely unjustified. The international media continued to feast on the story. British tabloids ran headlines like, "Barmy Yank bites guard" and "Tourist from our hell attacks hero." American media was more divided, with some outlets criticizing Margaret while others questioned whether the punishment fit the crime. Late-night comedians had a field day with the story. Talk show hosts made jokes about American tourists and British politeness. The incident became a cultural touchstone for discussions about entitlement, customer service expectations, and appropriate behavior abroad. Margaret's mugshot was shared millions of times, making her one of the most recognizable faces on the internet for all the wrong reasons. Her moment of rage had transformed her from an anonymous suburban mom into a global symbol of everything people hated about entitled behavior. 3 weeks after the incident, Margaret Stevens sat in a London courtroom facing the consequences of her moment of rage. The media circus had only intensified, with reporters from around the world covering what had become known as the Buckingham Palace bite trial. Margaret had lost 15 pounds from stress and barely slept since her arrest. Her expensive vacation clothes had been replaced with a conservative dark suit her lawyer had insisted upon. She looked nothing like the confident, entitled woman who had approached James Mitchell that morning. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity. Video evidence from multiple angles showed Margaret approaching James, escalating the confrontation, and ultimately biting him. Medical reports documented the injury. Witness testimony from tourists and palace staff painted a clear picture of an unprovoked attack. James Mitchell took the stand wearing his dress uniform, his composure professional despite the circus surrounding the case. He answered questions, calmly and factually, never showing anger or vindictiveness toward the woman who had attacked him. "Guard Mitchell, can you describe what you were thinking when Mrs. Stevens bit you?" asked the prosecutor. "Honestly, sir, I was shocked. In my training, we prepare for many situations, but being bitten by a tourist wasn't one of them. My first thought was concern about disease transmission, and my second was disappointment that someone would act that way at a place that means so much to our country." Margaret's defense attorney did his best with an impossible case. He argued that his client had been overwhelmed by culture shock, stressed by travel, and had acted impulsively without malicious intent. He portrayed her as a woman who had made a terrible mistake rather than a dangerous individual. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David Mills said during his closing argument, "my client's actions were wrong, but they were the result of a perfect storm of miscommunication, cultural differences, and momentary loss of control. She is not a career criminal or a dangerous person." But the prosecution's response was withering. This case isn't about cultural differences or miscommunication. It's about a grown woman who attacked a young man for doing his job professionally and courteously. Mrs. Stevens showed no remorse at the scene, no understanding of the seriousness of her actions, and continues to blame others for her violent behavior. While the trial proceeded, Margaret's life back home continued to disintegrate. Her employer had finally terminated her employment after patients continued to complain and boycott the practice. Tom's accounting firm had mutually agreed that he should take an extended leave of absence until the situation died down. Their daughter Jessica, a college senior, was dealing with her own fallout. Students and professors at her university had recognized her as Margaret's daughter from social media posts. She was being mocked, harassed, and ostracized for her mother's actions. "Dad, I can't go to class anymore," Jessica sobbed during a phone call to her father. "Everyone stares at me and makes biting noises when I walk by. My professors are treating me differently. This is ruining my life." Tom felt helpless watching his family fall apart because of his wife's actions. "Jessica, I'm so sorry. None of this is your fault, and it will pass eventually." "Will it, Dad? When you Google my name, Mom's mugshot comes up." How is that going to affect my job prospects when I graduate? The social media pile-on against Margaret had reached astronomical proportions. Her personal information had been leaked online, leading to thousands of people calling her home phone, emailing death threats, and leaving negative reviews for any business associated with her family. Someone had created a Wikipedia page dedicated to the incident. Margaret's face was being used in memes about entitled behavior, customer service complaints, and American tourist stereotypes. She had become a verb. To pull a Margaret Stevens meant to overreact dramatically to minor inconveniences. Dr. Patricia Wells, Margaret's former employer, gave an interview to local news defending her decision to fire Margaret. "We serve families and children every day. We cannot have someone associated with our practice who resorts to violence when frustrated. It sends the wrong message to our community." Meanwhile, James Mitchell was dealing with his own unwanted celebrity. The Justice for James campaign had raised over £200,000, which he announced he would donate to military veteran charities. He had received thousands of letters of support from around the world. "I never wanted to be famous for this," James told his commanding officer. "I just want to do my job and serve my country quietly." Major Williams nodded sympathetically. "Unfortunately, Mitchell, you've become a symbol. People see you as representing dignity and professionalism in the face of unreasonable behavior. That's not necessarily a bad thing." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on the assault charge. Margaret sat stone-faced as the verdict was read, finally beginning to accept that her version of events wasn't going to be believed by anyone. During the sentencing phase, Margaret was finally allowed to address the court. Her lawyer had coached her extensively on what to say, emphasizing remorse and responsibility. "Your Honor, I want to apologize to Guard Mitchell, to the people of Britain, and to my own family for my actions that day." Margaret read from a prepared statement, her voice shaking. "I was wrong to let my frustration get the better of me, and I deeply regret the pain I've caused to everyone involved." But even her apology felt hollow, more like something she was saying because she had to, rather than because she truly understood the impact of her actions. The judge, the Honorable Mr. Justice Thompson, was not impressed by Margaret's statement. He had reviewed all the evidence, including Margaret's behavior immediately after the incident, and her continued attempts to justify her actions during police interviews. "Mrs. Stevens, your assault on Guard Mitchell was unprovoked, filmed by dozens of witnesses, and carried out in full view of children and families visiting one of our nation's most important landmarks. Your behavior was not only criminal, but deeply disturbing." Margaret's heart pounded as she waited to learn her fate. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and even some tourists who had witnessed the original incident. The weight of global attention pressed down on her shoulders as the judge prepared to announce her sentence. Judge Thompson's voice rang clear through the packed London courtroom as he delivered Margaret Stevens' sentence. The room was silent except for the clicking of camera shutters and the scratching of reporters' pens. "Mrs. Stevens, I sentence you to 6 months imprisonment suspended for 2 years, provided you complete 200 hours of community service and undergo anger management counseling. You are also ordered to pay compensation to Mr. Mitchell for his medical expenses and emotional distress, totaling £5,000. Margaret's legs nearly gave out with relief. No immediate prison time meant she could return home to America, though the suspended sentence hung over her head like a sword. If she committed any crime in the next 2 years, she would serve the full 6 months behind bars. Her lawyer squeezed her arm reassuringly, but Margaret barely noticed. The reality was setting in that while she had avoided immediate imprisonment, her life as she knew it was over. The woman who had bitten a royal guard would follow her forever. Outside the courthouse, media chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions as Margaret was escorted to a waiting car, her face hidden behind sunglasses and a scarf. "Mrs. Stevens, do you have anything to say to Guard Mitchell? Will you be seeking mental health treatment? Do you regret your actions?" Margaret said nothing, but inside her head a voice was still whispering that the punishment didn't fit the crime. Even after everything, she struggled to fully accept responsibility for the international incident she had created over a perceived slight. James Mitchell watched the sentencing from the palace, surrounded by fellow guards who had supported him throughout the ordeal. When the sentence was announced, he felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but he took no pleasure in seeing another human being's life destroyed, even one who had attacked him. "How do you feel about the outcome?" asked a reporter who caught him leaving the courthouse later that day. "I'm satisfied that the legal system worked as it should," James replied diplomatically. "I hope Mrs. Stevens gets the help she needs to understand why her actions were wrong. And I hope this incident reminds everyone to treat service members and workers with basic respect." His mature response only enhanced his reputation as the dignified victim in the entire affair. James had become a symbol of professionalism and grace under pressure, while Margaret represented everything people disliked about entitled behavior. Margaret's flight back to New Jersey was a nightmare of stares and whispers. Fellow passengers recognized her despite her attempts at disguise. Flight attendants were professional but cold, and she overheard several conversations about that woman who bit the guard. When her plane touched down at Newark Airport, Margaret discovered that her notoriety had preceded her home. A small crowd of protesters and curious onlookers had gathered, some holding signs reading, "Shame" and "Apologize to Britain." Tom picked her up in their car, driving through the crowd in uncomfortable silence. The drive home gave them their first real opportunity to talk since the incident began. "Margaret, do you understand what you've done to our family?" Tom's voice was quiet, but filled with pain. "Jessica can't finish her senior year properly. I might lose my job permanently. Our neighbors won't look at us. We're getting hate mail every day." Margaret stared out the window at the familiar New Jersey suburbs that no longer felt like home. "I never meant for any of this to happen, Tom. It just got out of hand so quickly." "You bit someone, Margaret. You actually bit another human being because he wouldn't talk to you. How does that get out of hand accidentally?" For the first time since the incident, Margaret felt a crack in her defensive wall. Seeing her husband's pain, her daughter's suffering, and the destruction of their comfortable life forced her to confront the reality that her actions had consequences far beyond herself. Their house had been vandalized multiple times while Margaret was in London. Someone had spray-painted "Bite This" on their garage door. Eggs had been thrown at their windows. Their mailbox was stuffed with letters ranging from death threats to pleas for her to seek mental health treatment. The community service Margaret was required to complete became another source of humiliation. She was assigned to work at a local food bank, where her presence attracted unwanted attention and made other volunteers uncomfortable. Several clients recognized her and requested different volunteers to help them. "I can't do this," Margaret complained to her court-appointed social worker after her third day. "Everyone stares at me like I'm some kind of monster. This isn't helping anyone." The social worker, a patient woman named Carol Martinez, had dealt with many resistant clients over the years. "Margaret, the purpose of community service is to give back to society and hopefully help you understand the impact of your actions. Running away from uncomfortable feelings won't accomplish that." Margaret's anger management sessions were equally challenging. The group therapy format meant sitting in a circle with other people who had acted out in various ways, but none of their stories matched the global attention her case had received. "I'm different from all of you," Margaret told the group during her first session. "My situation was blown completely out of proportion by the media. I'm not an angry person normally." The therapist, Dr. Rachel Kim, had reviewed Margaret's file extensively. "Margaret, can you help the group understand what made your reaction proportionate to the situation you faced?" The question hung in the air as Margaret struggled to explain why being ignored by a guard justified biting him. For the first time, she was being asked to examine her thought process without anyone accepting her justifications. Meanwhile, James Mitchell was trying to return to normal life, but his newfound fame made that difficult. Tour groups specifically requested to see the guard who was bitten, turning his workplace into even more of a tourist attraction. His fellow guards good-naturedly nicknamed him Jaws, but the attention was wearing thin. The compensation money Margaret was ordered to pay became another point of contention. £5,000 was a significant sum for the Stevens family, especially with Tom's reduced income and mounting legal bills. Margaret resented having to pay for James's minor injury, still minimizing the seriousness of what she had done. "It's not like I really hurt him," she complained to Tom while writing the check. "Human bites heal. This is just punishment money." Tom looked at his wife with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "Margaret, you drew blood from another person's body with your teeth, over nothing. How can you still not see how wrong that was?" Months after the incident, Margaret was still struggling to find employment. Every job interview began the same way, with employers asking about the London situation. Most ended quickly after that discussion. Her face was too recognizable, her story too notorious for most businesses to risk the association. Jessica transferred to a different university to finish her degree, changing her major and using her mother's maiden name to avoid recognition. The incident had damaged her relationship with her mother perhaps irreparably. "Mom, I love you, but I can't be associated with what you did anymore," Jessica explained during a tense family dinner. "I'm trying to build a life, and your 5 minutes of internet fame is following me everywhere." Margaret finally broke down completely, sobbing at the kitchen table as the full weight of her actions finally hit her. Not the legal consequences or the media attention, but the personal cost to the people she claimed to love. "I was just so angry," she whispered through her tears. "He made me feel invisible and unimportant, and I couldn't stand it. But I never imagined it would destroy everything." Tom sat beside his wife, feeling both sympathy and exhaustion. "Margaret, you weren't invisible. You were just another tourist at a famous landmark. The guard wasn't required to make you feel special. Nobody is." A year later, Margaret Stevens remained a cautionary tale shared across social media whenever someone acted entitled in public. Videos of customer service meltdowns were inevitably compared to the woman who bit the royal guard. She had become a permanent part of internet culture, her moment of rage preserved forever in digital amber. James Mitchell continued his service with distinction, eventually being promoted and becoming an instructor for new guards. He spoke occasionally about the importance of maintaining professionalism in difficult situations, though he rarely mentioned Margaret by name. Margaret completed her community service and anger management requirements, but the suspended sentence remained a constant reminder of how quickly a life can change. She eventually found work at a small accounting firm in a different town, where her boss either didn't know or didn't care about her past. The incident taught the world a valuable lesson about the permanence of digital shame and the importance of thinking before acting. But for Margaret Stevens, the lesson came too late to save the life she had spent 52 years building. Her moment of entitled rage had cost her everything she valued, proving that sometimes the most bitter aftermath comes not from others but from the consequences of our own actions.